U.S. Army Lieutenant Kevin Walsh stood at the edge of the Vietnamese jungle and could not believe his eyes. He had seen it all: artillery barrages, helicopter raids, endless columns of men and machinery. But what was happening right now shook him to his core. Into the dense greenery before him, men from the Australian SAS were dissolving, without noise, without wasted movement, without fuss. They were not like men, but like shadows that knew how to switch off reality. They walked as if the jungle were their home, not a trap. They didn't break twigs, didn't snag on vines, didn't leave tracks. Their uniforms didn't rustle, their gear didn't rattle, their breathing didn't falter. Walsh remembered how American units moved through this same hell. Heavy footsteps, loud commands, the roar of radios, and constant nervous bustling. But these men moved so smoothly that a frightening thought surfaced in his mind. They flowed like water and vanished like steam. Walsh tried to catch on to something familiar, just one habit of a regular soldier, but he found nothing. There was no bravado here, no showy toughness, no loud words, only iron discipline and a calm that looked more dangerous than any scream. These men weren't playing at war. They lived inside it so naturally that the American officer felt uneasy. And then came the scariest part. Within minutes, he stopped seeing them. Not because they hid, not because they set an ambush, but because they simply ceased to exist to the human eye. The forest swallowed them without a trace. It was as if they had never been there. And in that moment, Walsh realized, if guys like this wanted to get close to you, you'd know about it too late. You wouldn't even hear the danger coming. You would only feel the cold inside you and the silence around you. But that was just the first blow. Because what followed sounds like a sensation no one wanted to admit aloud. At that moment, the Americans had nearly 500,000 men in Vietnam. 500,000. The most powerful war machine on the planet. And the Australian SAS numbered only 120. 120 men against a giant army. Yet it was they who forced experienced American officers to speak of them not as allies, but as something unnerving. Walsh heard the word more and more often, spoken quietly, almost superstitiously. Paraphrased a quote. Quia, not a pretty metaphor for the newspapers, not an army joke, but a genuine sensation. These people arrived and vanished, leaving behind only emptiness and a panic-stricken tremble in those who tried to understand how they did it. American intelligence was used to numbers, diagrams, radio intercepts, and airstrikes. But here, nothing worked. They couldn't even explain why these fighters operated so precisely and silently. And here begins the real intrigue, reeking of scandal. Because the Pentagon, of course, couldn't just swallow this. The richest and strongest army in the world could not accept that a couple of hundred Australians were doing what thousands could not. The Americans decided, if the SAS can do it, we can too. We just need to copy the methods, replicate the training, take the best techniques, and do the same thing ourselves. But that was just the first step toward a failure that would later be called a quiet humiliation. Because in the history of the SAS, there is one brutal truth. They cannot be replicated by instruction manuals. They cannot be assembled from components like a weapon. They cannot be made quickly, even if you have billions of dollars and a whole army. And Walsh, in that minute when the Australians dissolved into the Green Wall, did not yet know the main thing. America would soon try to become just like them, and would pay for it with the most unpleasant currency: public disappointment and botched operations. Tell me honestly, would you believe that 120 men could make a superpower nervous? Would you believe that experienced American officers would look at these fighters as something almost supernatural? Then hold on tight, because everything you've heard about the Vietnam War is about to look different. And next, you will learn exactly how the SAS turned the jungle into their weapon, and why the Americans never managed to become like them, even when they tried their hardest. 1966. Vietnam is boiling, thundering, burning, and the American war machine is revved to the limit. Nearly 500,000 U.S. soldiers in the country, aviation, artillery, armor, helicopter assaults, everything designed to crush, destroy, and control. Against this backdrop appears a tiny number that sounds almost mocking: 120 fighters of the Australian SAS. 120 against a giant accustomed to solving everything with mass and fire. The American command initially perceived this as a symbolic gesture, as if Australia sent a checkbox, a small sign of alliance to be part of the coalition. Colonel Charles Patterson would later formulate the mood without any diplomacy. These people seemed more of a political token than a real force. And isn't that logical? When you have hundreds of thousands of troops, tanks, and control of the skies, what can a handful of men in light uniforms without heavy support possibly change? But that was just the first blow. Because within mere weeks, the Americans began to notice something strange. These Australians didn't want to fight by the rules of American doctrine. They didn't demand artillery barrages, didn't ask for more helicopters, didn't stage demonstrative sweeps. They looked as if they didn't need the usual Army luxuries at all. And then a question arose that made staff officers scratch their heads. Why do they almost always walk when there is so much machinery and air support around? The answer sounded like a challenge to the entire American philosophy of war. The SAS preferred not a show of force, but the hunt. Not sweep everything with fire, but find, study, strike, and vanish. American units often moved big. Many people, constant radio chatter, fear of ambush, readiness to call in airstrikes at the first signal. The Australians moved differently. Small groups, minimum comms, maximum silence, as if every extra rustle was a direct ticket to tragedy. But that was just the first blow, because the numbers began to look indecent. Historian Trevor Dupuy, one of the most cited analysts of combat effectiveness, later noted, the SAS in Vietnam achieved a kill ratio of up to 21-1. 21-1. That sounds like a statistic from a legend, not a real conflict. And all this from a unit the Americans initially considered a drop in the bucket and a political declaration. Then came the real dissonance. American reports were used to seeing success as the result of firepower, technology, and territory control. But the SAS acted as if territory didn't matter at all. They were interested in information, tracks, routes, weak points, and enemy psychology. Colonel David Hackworth, a man of experience and sharp tongue, admitted, "The Australians, bow wow, quote 11. And it worked not by accident, but regularly, almost coldly and systematically. But that was just the first blow, because by mid-1967, American officers began asking questions not condescendingly, but nervously. If these 120 men are capable of such results, what would happen if there were more of them? And why, with all our resources, can we not achieve the same effect? From that moment, the Australians ceased to be a quote 12 and turned into a strange phenomenon that could not be explained by the usual logic of the U.S. Army. And then a thought hung in the air, smelling of both envy and anxiety. These people seemed to come from a different school of war, from a school where you win not by numbers, but by discipline, not by noise, but by silence, not by showy power, but by precision. And the Pentagon would very soon decide to test the most dangerous assumption. Can we take this quote 13 and repeat it with American hands? Only no one yet understood that this would not be copying, but a collision of two cultures ending in loud disappointment. And here the Americans made the mistake that everyone makes when first encountering the SAS. They thought it was a set of clever tricks or special gear, but the truth turned out to be much harsher and more unpleasant. The Australians were dangerous not because they had better rifles or new radios. They were dangerous because they were created as a distinct species of soldier. Over years, ruthlessly, almost fanatically. The SAS in Australia was not a regular unit you got into quote 15. It was a closed caste system where the right to stay had to be proven every day. Their world relied on one principle. You either measure up, or you disappear from the roster. Not temporarily, not quote 16, but forever. That is why one American instructor later called their training quote 17, and that sounds not like a compliment but a warning. But that was just the first blow, because SAS selection was not an exam, but a meat grinder. It lasted about 6 months, and this period was designed to break illusions, not men. On average, about 80% of candidates did not pass, and we are not talking about weak soldiers, but those who were already better than average. They were wrung out by marches, navigation, stress, solitude, cold, and hunger, until only those remained who could keep a clear head when the body screamed to stop. The next layer was constant testing that didn't end after graduation. In the SAS, there was no feeling that you had earned the right to be there forever. Every mission, every march, every mistake became a mark against you, and no one turned a blind eye to the little things. They were taught not heroism but control, not spectacular attacks but the ability to keep it together when chaos erupts. That's why Americans said these men looked cold, even frighteningly calm, as if fear had been burned out of them in training. But that was just the first blow, because the SAS didn't stop at army courses. They collected knowledge like predators collect scents. They were taught by veterans who had already mastered the jungle, and by those who understood the Australian wilderness better than any textbook. Training included tracking skills borrowed from Aboriginal trackers, reading the ground, seeing a broken leaf, noticing a barely visible footprint, determining direction by trifles a regular soldier wouldn't even see. This wasn't quote 19, it was the practical science of survival and hunting. And then came a veritable encyclopedia of skills impossible to cram into a few weeks of training. They were taught silent movement, camouflage, patience in observation posts, precision shooting at close range, night navigation, small unit tactics, covert patrolling, setting ambushes, and vanishing without a trace. They had to operate with equal confidence in the dark, in the rain, in the heat, without sleep, without support. And most importantly, they were taught to think, not wait for orders. This is exactly what would later drive the Americans crazy. The SAS could operate far from base for weeks, making decisions on the spot, without constant reports and headquarters approval. But that was just the first blow, because now it becomes clear, the SAS are not, quote, 20, they are a separate system where culture is more important than technique, and control is more important than force. These men didn't seek glory, didn't put on a show, didn't try to impress. They simply completed the task and disappeared, leaving the enemy with one feeling: anxious, sticky, humiliating. You were watched, but you saw no one. And as soon as the Americans realized that the secret was not in the tricks, but in the culture, an even more dangerous thought appeared in their heads. If this isn't a technique, but a system, can we build the same system ourselves? Can we take their method and insert it into the American army, where everything relies on mass, technology, and rigid bureaucracy? The answer to this question would ring louder than any explosion, and it would begin to manifest on the very first real patrols in the jungle. It was in the field that the SAS transformed from, quote, 21, quote, to frighteningly effective. Their work began not with loud attacks, but with a quiet insertion that the Americans barely noticed. At night, a group would go into the jungle as if dissolving into ink-black darkness. No unnecessary talk, no extra steps, no heroism on display. Only cold calculation and discipline that sent shivers down Allied spines. By day, they barely moved. They lay in cover for hours, like parts of the earth itself, and watched. To the enemy, it seemed empty here, that the forest was silent, that one could relax, but the SAS were reading every detail. The path, the tracks, the scents, the pauses, the habits. Their main power wasn't that they shot fast, but that they knew beforehand when and where the enemy would appear. But that was just the first blow, because their communications looked like a mockery of American rules. In the U.S. Army, the radio ran almost constantly. Checks, reports, requests, confirmations. With the SAS, the opposite. The radio was turned on for mere seconds, only for business, and then vanished into silence again. It was iron logic. The less you speak, the lower the chance you'll be detected. And the less you shine, the more you control the jungle. When they found a target, the next part began, the most brutal and precise. The SAS didn't create chaos. They built a trap. They chose a spot that would work against the enemy. A narrow trail, a bend, a swampy low ground. A place where quick deployment was impossible. They prepared a kill zone so that everything would happen instantly, without a second chance for those who stepped inside. The Americans called it the perfect ambush because it looked like a mathematical formula. There is an entrance, but no exit. And here appears a detail that makes this story truly terrifying. The SAS let the target approach to a distance of about 20 meters. 20 meters. That's almost the length of a room, almost a handshake, almost a look in the face. They didn't strike from afar, they waited until the hit was guaranteed. One fighter later explained it simply: if you open fire too early, you turn a hunt into a noisy firefight, and that is no longer SAS work. Their style was different, short, precise, without unnecessary sound, but that was just the first blow, because their tactic always had a second part: disappearance. The ambush could last less than a minute, sometimes mere seconds, and immediately after, the group was already leaving no tracks, not lingering, not trying to hold ground. They acted as if the target itself was just an episode, and the main thing was to leave clean, not letting the enemy recover and start a pursuit. This amazed the Americans. Most units after contact started making noise, reporting, calling in support, looking for confirmation of success. The SAS left as if they had never been there. This was their hunt. They didn't fight the jungle. They used it as an ally. Silence was their weapon. Patience was their ammo, and surprise was their striking force. And every time the Americans heard about a new SAS operation, the same question arose. How can these people be so precise, so invisible, and so cold-blooded? But that was just the first blow, because soon an operation would occur after which the American staff would essentially pronounce a sentence on the logic of war. And it was there that it became clear. The SAS in Vietnam weren't just surviving. They dictated the rules, forcing the enemy to fear their own shadow. Operation Marsden became that very story, after which American HQs began nervously rechecking reports, as if looking at a prank rather than a combat log. It started mundanely, even boringly. A small SAS patrol, just 6 men, received a task to observe an area and find out who was moving through the jungle near key trails. No helicopter shows, no columns, no walls of fire. Only 6 men and a thick green wall where any extra sound turns into a death sentence. They entered the area quietly, as only those taught to be part of nature can. Then began what a regular soldier considers torture, and the SAS a normal workday. 13 hours of waiting. 13 hours of immobility, mosquitoes, humidity, patience, and total silence. They didn't move, didn't argue, didn't quote 26 themselves with conversation. They just listened to the jungle as if reading a newspaper, waiting for the moment that would decide everything. But that was just the first blow, because at some point the silence ended. Enemy forces appeared on the trail, and by scale, this wasn't a random group. These were battalion elements, a chain of men confident that this sector was safe. And in that moment, the SAS did what would later shock American officers. They allowed the column to approach almost point blank, not revealing themselves by a single rustle. There was no hysteria here, no chaos, no break in discipline. There was a cold, honed decision. The strike must be short and final. The exact time in the reports looked like a newspaper sensation. Around 4:40 p.m., when the enemy entered the pre-selected kill zone, the SAS opened fire. It lasted approximately 90 seconds. 90 seconds that turned the confident movement of battalion elements into total disarray. The strike was so precise that among those hit was the battalion commander, and this key detail would later make American analysts wince. Such coincidences almost never happen by accident. But that was just the first blow, because then happened what makes this operation a legend. The SAS didn't start watching saw, quote, 28 watchings with noise, didn't linger, didn't get caught up in the thrill. They did what a professional does, not a movie hero. They quickly gathered trophies and documents that turned out to be more important than any loud report. Papers, maps, notes, plans, things that revealed routes, connections, and future enemy actions. And then they disappeared just as they had arrived, without casualties, without tracks, without trying to explain to the world how cool they were. When the information reached American headquarters, the reaction was almost hysterical. Officers used to large operations, and thousands of men looked at the numbers and didn't understand how it was possible. 6 men against battalion elements, a precise strike, the commander hit, documents seized, and a clean extraction. The reports even preserved a phrase that sounded like an admission of defeat for logic. This cannot be true. For an army that lived by scale and fire, such an operation looked like something from another reality. But that was just the first blow, because Marsden became not just a successful ambush. It became a humiliating question for the American system. If a handful of men can do this, what do they know that a giant army does not? And it was after this operation that the Pentagon began thinking about the most dangerous experiment. They wanted to repeat it. They wanted to copy it. They wanted to make an American SAS. Only ahead of them awaited a meeting with the cruelest truth of war. Some things cannot be bought, cannot be rushed, and cannot be reproduced by order. After Marsden, the air in the Pentagon smelled not just of interest, but of real jealousy. America was not used to someone nearby demonstrating efficiency that couldn't be explained by their own manuals, and a decision matured quickly. If the Australians can do it, Americans must be able to do it too. Thus appeared Operation Quote 32, an experiment intended to prove that the SAS style could be reproduced if men were trained correctly and given the same rules of the game. Americans began training under Australian methodologies and with maximum seriousness. Small groups, stealth, night movement, communication discipline, patience at observation posts, papers, diagrams, instructions, everything looked perfect. It seemed only one thing remained. Go into the jungle and do the same. But war is not a classroom, and the jungle does not forgive even small illusions. But that was just the first blow, because the first mission fell apart almost instantly. About 30 hours after deployment, it became clear. The Americans hadn't become ghosts. They remained who they were. They moved faster than necessary, made noise where silence was needed, and, worst of all, talked too much. Too much conversation, too many unnecessary gestures, too much nervous energy. And this, in the SAS, was considered a fatal error. When you talk a lot, it's like shouting to the jungle where to find you. Then began the part that turns beautiful theory into a bitter report. The Australians could maintain discipline for weeks, keeping silence and control, while the Americans snapped back to their habitual style. Their culture demanded constant confirmation, constant interaction, a constant feeling that there are many of us and we are in control. Even when explained that in a covert war, control is silence, they returned to what had been ingrained by years of service. And so, the experiment that was supposed to be a triumph began to look like a quiet failure. But that was just the first blow, because the numbers began to sound humiliating. Reports compared results. Australians could complete tasks with an efficiency of about 85%, while Americans about 40%. The difference looked not like slightly worse, but like a different level of reality. Yes, the Americans could get results too. They weren't helpless. But there was no stability. Their success depended on luck, on chance, on circumstances. The SAS worked as if they had a built-in mechanism that wouldn't let them make mistakes. And then a thought arose that became a turning point and sounded like a cold diagnosis. It wasn't a problem of talent, it was a problem of culture. That is exactly how the officers observing the experiment formulated it. It's not that Americans aren't capable, it's that their system doesn't grow such a soldier. You can give a man new techniques, but you can't rewire his habits, fears, discipline, and attitude toward risk in a few weeks. The SAS didn't play it stealth, they lived it. But that was just the first blow, because quote 37 revealed an even more unpleasant thing. The American Army was built on power, on support, on constant communication, and the feeling that you always have reserves. The SAS were built on autonomy, on self-reliance, and the readiness to exist in the jungle without unnecessary strings to headquarters. And when the Americans tried to play this game, they faced internal resistance from their own system. They took a step toward silence and immediately rolled back, because their world demanded noise and confirmations. By the end of the experiment, it was clear. The copy did not become the original. The Americans took some elements and managed to improve individual skills, but reproducing the quote 38 effect failed. And this hit their ego harder than any criticism, because at that moment, the Pentagon began to understand. Their problem wasn't that they didn't know the tactics. Their problem was that they weren't ready to live the way the SAS lived. But that was just the first blow, because the most unpleasant truth lies ahead. The Australians won not due to tricks, but due to how their system, their discipline, and their trust in men on the ground were structured. And this would be the reason why America, having everything, never managed to become what those 120 fighters were in the jungles of Vietnam. After the failure of the experiment, the Americans tried to find excuses. Maybe the wrong people, maybe not enough time, maybe the jungle was wrong. But the truth was coarser than any excuse. The SAS couldn't be transplanted like a plant because their roots went deep into culture and trust. The Australians gave their men what the American Army in those years simply didn't know how to give: autonomy on the ground and the right to act without constant control from above. The SS could go into the jungle for weeks and return with results, not a stack of explanations. They were trusted not because they were teachers' pets, but because their system bred people who didn't break or get lost without headquarters. They planned on the spot, changed routes according to the situation, could call off contact or, conversely, strike instantly without asking permission from an officer dozens of kilometers away. This was their strength. Decisions were made where it smelled of earth and footsteps were heard, not where it smelled of paper and coffee. But that was just the first blow, because the American system worked differently, and it was shackled in rules like chains. American units lived in a hierarchy where everything had to be approved, confirmed, and recorded. Constant radio checks, constant reports, a constant feeling that without comms you don't exist, plus mandatory safety measures. Quick reaction forces, artillery support approval, evacuation plans, coordinate confirmation, confirmation of confirmation. In theory, it looked rational, but in the jungle, it turned into the killer of surprise. And here arises a cruel paradox. For the SAS, silence and speed were the guarantee of success. For the Americans, silence looked like a risk and speed like irresponsibility. Even when American soldiers wanted to act covertly, their own system forced them to light up. Must report, must confirm, must get permission, must ensure insurance. And while this whole bureaucratic ritual is performed, the enemy has either left or realized they are being hunted. But that was just the first blow, because veterans spoke about this without diplomacy. In the memoirs of soldiers, an admission sounded that cuts like a knife. By the time all headquarters requirements were met, the target already knew they were being tracked. One such fighter, Roy Benavides, a man considered a true legend in Vietnam, bluntly admitted, The American machine often destroyed perfect plans itself, not because the people were bad, but because the rules were stronger than the people. And when you are forced to be correct, you stop being invisible. The SAS acted as hunters, not bureaucrats. They didn't request quote 42 quote, they built it and executed it when necessary. They didn't do 10 radio checks a day because they knew every extra signal is a chance for the enemy to figure out where you are. They didn't keep a huge reserve nearby because the reserve itself creates noise and tracks. Their approach was frighteningly simple. The less you exist for the system, the more you exist for the result. But that was just the first blow, because this is where the main conclusion is born, one the Pentagon found unpleasant to say out loud. The problem wasn't tactics. The problem was that the SAS is the product of a specific culture where a fighter is trusted and required to do the impossible, and then given the right to act. The American Army demanded discipline, but its discipline was different. The discipline of reporting, the discipline of control, the discipline of everything under surveillance. And that is why the copy didn't work. Because the Americans tried to embed SAS tactics into a system that by its nature destroyed them. It was a conflict of quote 44 and bureaucracy, where bureaucracy almost always wins. And the more the USA tried to become invisible, the louder they became in the jungle. But that was just the first blow, because at this moment, the Americans did take one important step. They realized that perfect copying wouldn't happen, but they could take parts of the ideas and embed them where they would take root. And this is how the next stage of history begins: compromise, adaptation, and the creation of new units that would try to at least approach what the SAS did in Vietnam almost effortlessly. After the painful realization that making an American SAS by the book was impossible, the US didn't slam the door. Washington understood the main thing. If you can't copy it whole, you must take it in pieces. Don't try to rewire the culture of the entire army, but extract from the Australian experience what can realistically be built into the American system. And here, history becomes especially interesting because instead of proud denial, a pragmatic compromise begins. The SAS, in turn, didn't live in a vacuum. They were too smart to ignore the scale of the American machine. The Australians learned to work alongside a huge army without dissolving or losing their ghostly effectiveness. They adapted certain procedures, coordinated interaction, used support when necessary, but didn't let the system take away their main asset, autonomy and silence. It looked like a delicate balance, playing by the Allies' rules just enough not to turn into another regular infantry unit. But that was just the first blow, because the Americans began choosing exactly who to give these pieces of experience to. And first in line were those units that already lived closer to the spirit of the SAS. The Navy SEALs perceived stealth methods not as fantasy, but as practice. They were interested in the same things: small groups, precise infiltration, quick extraction, night work, minimum unnecessary noise. For them, the Australian experience wasn't exotic, but an amplifier of what they were already trying to do. Next, attention shifted to LRRPs, long-range reconnaissance patrols, who were already operating in a mode of constant risk. It was there that SAS methods began to take root best, because these men didn't need the price of silence explained to them. They already knew that a loud army in the jungle becomes a target. They were taught to move better, hide better, endure better, observe better, and most importantly, to leave better, without leaving traces, because that was half the victory. But that was just the first blow, because even partial implementation changed the tone of American operations. They didn't become quote 49 quote, but they became more dangerous, more precise, and more cunning. American reports began to record an increase in the effectiveness of reconnaissance actions, improved stealth, and smarter ambushes. And this is important. The story doesn't turn into a cheap humiliation of the USA. It is a story about how a huge system slowly learns from a small but incredibly toothy force. The Australians continued to remain the benchmark that irritated and inspired simultaneously. Their success couldn't be fully repeated, but it could be acknowledged. In those same analytical circles, a thought sounded that became almost official. The Australians showed that war in the jungle is not about power, but about mastery. And that mastery begins not with a weapon, but with how you think, how you move, and how you stay silent. But that was just the first blow, because ahead lies a moment when the SAS will again show what looks like pure audacity. And that is when the Americans will finally understand. Even if you took part of their experience, they still remain a step ahead. Their best operations are still to come, and one of them will force the enemy to write words in diaries that look like an admission of horror, because the quote 50 weren't a legend for newspapers. They were a reality that broke nerves and changed the war. 1969 became for the SAS in Vietnam a season that can only be called peak hunting. While huge armies continued to thunder with machinery and reports, the Australians acted quietly, but with such effectiveness that it looked almost indecent. They conducted hundreds of patrols, and every successful ambush turned into a new terrifying legend whispered not only by allies but by the enemy. A figure would later surface in documents. About 1,200 patrols over the campaign years, and this isn't just a statistic, but proof of the frenzied intensity of their work. It is during this period that Operation '52 flares up, which many call a demonstration of what the SAS is capable of when operating at maximum. There were no isolated episodes of luck here. There was a series of precise strikes against platoons and even companies, when small groups of Australians turned the jungle into a trap from which it was impossible to exit without casualties. Their ambushes were like a surgical incision, short, fast, without unnecessary noise. And most annoying for the enemy, after the strike, they disappeared, leaving no opportunity to '53 and regain control. But that was just the first blow, because the numbers looked like a challenge to common sense. Reports featured ratios usually found in myths, 25-1 in individual episodes, and the overall loss exchange rate reached '54, a figure military analysts pronounced with caution, as if afraid it sounded too bold. For a regular unit, such a ratio is a dream. For the SAS, it became a reality they maintained not once, but again and again, turning their style into industrial efficiency. The Americans witnessing this nearby noted a strange feeling, as if the Australians possessed an extra sense. They found tracks where others saw only mud. They heard movement where others heard only rain. One observer spoke of them as people who '55, and this sounded not like poetry but like an attempt to explain the impossible. The SAS began to seem not just fighters, but something like a mechanism perfectly adapted to the jungle. But that was just the first blow, because the strongest proof of their influence came not from American reports, but from inside the enemy's head. In the diary of one Viet Cong fighter was an entry that reads like a confession of fear. It said the Australians were not human, that they move like shadows and appear out of thin air. And this is not propaganda, not a movie, not an ally's invention. These are the words of a man who was on the other side and saw fighters vanish and return at the most unexpected times. The psychological effect turned out to be scarier than any statistic. The Viet Cong, accustomed to ambushes and covert war, suddenly faced the fact that their own methods had been turned against them. The forest, which used to protect, became a source of terror. Any trail could be under control. Any stop could be fatal. And that was when the nickname finally stuck to the SAS, sounding like a verdict. '59, not a pretty cliche, but a feeling of constant pursuit when you don't know if you are being watched right now. But that was just the first blow, because the fear of the enemy became a symbol of victory that cannot be faked. When the enemy starts believing he is always seen, he loses the initiative. He becomes more cautious, slower, more nervous. He starts making mistakes. And the SAS achieved this not with loud attacks, but with silence, patience, and precision that breaks the psyche harder than an explosion. In 1970, the results only solidified. The SAS continued to work as if they didn't need a pause, and every new successful clash confirmed that this was not a series of lucky breaks, but a system. That is why the Americans, who had already tried to copy their style, looked at these reports with bitter respect. They understood, you can take some methods, you can improve your units, but repeating the '60 effect is impossible without that same culture and that same fanatical control. But that was just the first blow, because ahead remains the final question that makes the whole story even more powerful. If the SAS were so effective, why is so little known about them? Why did their operations remain in the shadows for so long? And their contributions sound like a '61 next to the American scale? And what exactly from their experience would later become the foundation for new elite units that would appear after Vietnam? The answer leads straight to the last part of this story, to the legacy that changed special operations for decades to come. 1971 became the moment when the '62 Bao vanished not only into the forests of Vietnam, but from the public eye. The Australian SAS finished their campaign and left as quietly as they had operated, without parades, without loud statements, without a desire to turn their work into a show. But in Allied headquarters, the same question lingered for a long time. How is it possible that 120 men did what an army of hundreds of thousands could not replicate? And why, even after all the reports, observations, and training, did the U.S. never, Quote, 63 washings of this efficiency. America took a lot from the SAS. It adopted individual elements, night patrols, better stealth movement, patience, small group work, stricter communication discipline. This went into practice with the SEALS LRRPS and those who would later become the core of a new generation of special units. But they never got the main thing. Not because Americans were worse or weaker, but because a system accustomed to winning by mass and control cannot instantly become a system of trust and autonomy. Tactics transfer to a textbook, but culture transfers only through years and through people who live by these rules every day. But that was just the first blow, because the influence of the SAS didn't end with Vietnam. It simply moved into the next era, where special operations began to change the face of war. In 1977, Delta Force would appear in the US, a unit created with the understanding that elite warfare does not tolerate bureaucratic noise. The Americans officially began building what they had previously observed in the Australians: professional culture, selection, autonomy, the ability to operate far and quiet. And even if the SAS weren't the only source of inspiration, their Vietnam experience became one of those dark threads stretching into the new generation of special forces. The history of the SAS in Vietnam leaves behind an aphorism that sounds like a sentence to anyone who believes only in technology. Culture shapes capabilities. It is not the weapon that makes a unit great, but the people who are taught for years to be invisible, patient, and ruthlessly disciplined. You can buy the best helicopters, install the most expensive radios, fill the sky with aircraft. But if you don't know how to be silent, if you don't know how to wait, if you don't know how to think on the ground and act without a hint from headquarters, the jungle will still be stronger. But that was just the first blow, because phantoms is not a metaphor, but a result. The Viet Cong remembered them not by operation names or unit numbers. They remembered them by the feeling that you are being watched from the forest, and you cannot see the watcher. This is the highest form of control, not occupying territory, but making the enemy afraid to move along his own path. And when the enemy's fear becomes systemic, it means you have won not only the battle, but inside his head. The final lesson of this story sounds harsh and beautiful at the same time. War is not won by numbers alone, even if there are 500,000 of them. War is not won by technology alone, even if it is the most expensive on the planet. It is won by small groups of people who know how to be a shadow, know how to turn silence into a weapon, and know how to vanish so that after them remains only emptiness and the question, who was even here? That is why the SAS in Vietnam became a legend that they tried to repeat, but never managed to clone. But that was just the first blow, because the real sensation lies elsewhere. These 120 men proved to the world that the main strength of an army is not in quantity, but in quality. And if you want to understand how elite units are born and why some of them become almost mythical, you only need to remember one thing. Phantoms do not appear out of thin air. They are created, and it is this, not loud technology, that changes the history of special operations.